Claude Stuczynski is Associate Professor in the Department of General History at Bar-Ilan University and a board member of the Center for the Study of Conversions and Interreligious Encounters at Ben-Gurion University. His research is focused on the relationship between religion and politics in medieval and early modern times, and more precisely on the theological political dimension of the Converso phenomenon in early modern Iberia and beyond. In fact, Claude Stuczynski is one of the leading scholars worldwide in a new approach to the study of Portuguese conversos, and he has published and edited a number of prime articles and books on the topic. Among them are his Hebrew monograph, Between Religion and Religiosity Among the New Christians of Braganza in the 16th Century, a new edition of Shmuel Schwartz, The New Christians in Portugal in the 20th Century, a volume together with Avriel Bar-Levav for Joseph Kaplan, Baderech El HaModerna, published in 2018, another volume together with Bruno Feitler for Roberto Bachmann, Portuguese Jews, New Christians and New Jews, also in 2018, and together with David Graysboard, a special issue of the journal Jewish History dedicated to early modern Portuguese New Christian identities. Last but not least, in 2018-19, Claude has been awarded the chair for Jewish-Christian relations at the University Center St. Ignatius in Antwerp and the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp. And in 2022-23, he will be one of the principal investigators of a research group dedicated to the study of conversos and new Jews at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Today, Claude Stuczynski has agreed to introduce us to the fascinating world of Converso crypto-Judaism, past and present and past, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. Dear Claude, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sina, the kind organizers. I don't want to name them because I afraid to forget, but you make me feel at home. This is the second time. Thank you so much. I want also to express a word of admiration for the students. I shared with them 2 days ago with you. I was impressed by your questions and comments, and I hope that you will persist today also. Since my lecture is addressed to a very eclectic public, some of them interested in Sephardic issues, some of them not. Some of them, they are leading specialists on Conversos and Sephardim, and I have some of my friends here and some not. Then what I am going to do is to divide my lecture into parts. The first part, I will refer to common knowledge, but from my particular viewpoint. And then the final part, I will be briefly advance 2 arguments through 2 examples. And then it will be the occasion to discuss and to disagree with me. Then I will begin by reading the first part, and then I will speak orally the last one. From Enlightenment and emancipatory times, the late medieval and early modern Iberian Marrano or Converso phenomenon arises interest and fascination among many Jews, Jewish study scholars, and general public as well, those who are interested in Jewish issues, of course, mostly for generating a strange sensation of déjà vu of cardinal aspects of modern and contemporary Jewish life. Already in Heinrich Heine's Book of Songs, 1827, it is possible to clearly see in the character of the Spanish enigmatic caballero and converso lover of Doña Clara, a mirror of the existential dramas and dilemmas experienced by the author and by many of its Jewish original or initial readers. I quote, "Hark, they summon me, my darling. But before I go, oh, tell me what your precious name is, which is so closely you hast hidden." And the knight, with gentle laughter, kissed the fingers of his Donna, kissed her lips, and kissed her forehead. And at the last these words he uttered, "I, Senora, your beloved, am the son of the respected, worthy, erudite Grand Rabbi Israel of Zaragoza." End of quotation. At the same time, the Iberian Converso phenomenon tells also a great deal about Jews living in present times, not only because, like the Conversos, many Jews in the 19th and the 20th century were compelled to hide their identities through religious conversion or cultural assimilation in order to be fully integrated into secularized but still deeply Christian societies. The identification of early modern Conversos with the Jewish condition in present times mostly stems from what it is perceived today as an analogous way of negotiating, combining, and compartmentalizing the Jewish with the non-Jewish in the public and private sphere, and even within the inner individual self. According to many present-day observers, Conversos identities, which merged in Spain and Portugal under the generally violent circumstances of mass conversions to Christianity, and were followed by inquisitorial persecution, social exclusion grounded on laws of purity of blood, the creation of clandestine forms of concealed Judaism, and the reinforcement of the ethnic ties between these Christian members of the Hebrew nation and their Jewish relatives in the Sephardic diaspora, became to be more and more perceived as an historical prelude to Jewish modernity, and even as its ultimate archetype. That said, one thing is to understand that for the British historian of the 20th century, Cecil Rhodes, it was natural to link between the Iberian Converso past and the present condition of the Jews living in Nazi Germany after he was acquainted with the racial laws of Nuremberg. But another thing is to endorse the parallelism made after the Shoah by Jewish philosophers and intellectuals such as Jacques Derrida, Edgar Morin, Yirmiyahu Yovel, and more recently, Agatha Bielik-Robson and Donatella Di Cesare. Despite the nuances between them, all of them see in the Conversos a phenomenon of divided selves and or Judeo-Gentile hybrid identities as analogous with modern and contemporary forms of Jewishness. In some cases, this composite and liquid portrait of the Conversos' identities aim to be also a means to avoid the traps of Jewish essentialism and chauvinistic parochialism today, whether in Israel or outside. That is why Derrida and Morin define themselves with great pride as neo-Maran, new Marans, in order to detach themselves from a communitarian sense of Jewishness, but still define themselves somehow as related to Judaism. In this way, the tragic character of the Iberian Converso situations turned to be a felicitous source of inspiration for the present and the future of Jewish liberal thinking. To put things differently, if the Iberian Converso phenomenon was artificially created by mostly un-Jewish and negative historical circumstances, now it became retroactively perceived by leading Jewish thinkers as the most appropriate way to be simultaneously modern and Jewish. Paradoxically, Converso purported elusiveness merged as the most authentically Jewish way of living in our multicultural and globalized world. I believe that this compelling portrait of the Conversos is largely the result of an historical fabrication and wishful thinking. Perhaps the first scholars which gave this character was the Spinoza German scholar Karl Gebhardt, who in 1922 inferred from the autobiography of the 17th century ex-converso heterodox Jew, Uriel da Costa, through his exemplar Humanae Vitae, that the converso or the Marrano, I quote, is a Catholic without belief and a Jew without knowledge, but in will a Jew. Der Marrane ist ein Katholik ohne Glauben und ein Jude ohne Wissen, doch Jude in Willen. For Gebhardt, da Costa was much more than the ultimate representative of the entire Converso group. Like a sort of John the Baptist, his heterodoxy announced the advent of an illustrious member of the ex-Converso Jewish community of Amsterdam, the most illustrious of all, Baruch Spinoza, understood by Gebhardt as the embodiment of Jewish modernity. Let us also remind that almost 30 years later, the Dutch Hispanist scholar Jonas Andries van Praag identified in those conversos who returned to open Judaism in the Sephardic diaspora a phenomenon he called souls in dispute, in Spanish almas en litigio, between their previous Iberian education and background and their new Jewish commitments. No wonder that the above-mentioned thinkers, Derrida and Iobel and others, yes, fell immediately in love under the spell of Gebhardt and Van Praag and ignored or minimized the corrective caveats made by historians of Conversos and Western Sephardim, like Roth, Israel Salvatore Reva, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and more recently, Joseph Kaplan, who showed, among others, that most of the Conversos were probably less nonconformist than Acosta. Of course, that Spinoza was not a Converso, but a son of a Converso, and that in some case, their purported souls in dispute were tempered either by previous crypto-Jewish traditions and identities in some cases in Iberia, and generally by the sustained effort made by leaders of the Western Sephardic communities to harmonize between the Iberian culture and the Jewish rabbinic way of life. The problem is that these historical researches, these corrective researches, were partly undermined from within by other historians such as Nathan Wachtel, and in some cases, even by themselves along the time. In his Faith of Remembrance, La Foi du Souvenir, 2003 in French, Wachtel argued that more than being a theology or a religiosity, crypto-Judaism was one of those channels through which conversos could express their positive attachment vis-a-vis the memory of their ancestors. That is why he claimed that for Christoph Jews, the most important thing was not to observe every prescription of their Marrano hidden law, called Law of Moses, but to fulfill a minimum of required things in order to feel part of that Marrano Jewish long-lasting tradition, much like many contemporary secular Jews who perceive their commitment to religious rituals not as a covenant with God, but as a matter of Jewish culture and collective solidarity. By arguing that crypto-Judaism was merely a faith of remembrance, Waschtel was probably reacting against previous essentialist perception of the conversos that perceived them as heroic crypto-Judaizers and celebrated crypto-Judaism as authentic residues of medieval Sephardic Judaism. This was in great part the case of Samuel Schwartz, the discoverer of 20th century Marranism in Portugal. It is true that Schwartz was a curious-minded engineer born in Poland, and he was not a professional historian. However, his providential discovery in 1917 in the village of Belmonte in the northeastern regions of the Vega, of descendants of conversos, who still kept alive a set of rich crypto-Jewish traditions, including prayers, rituals, beliefs, and even leadership, tremendously influenced on learned and popular views about conversos and crypto-Judaism as well. Whereas Schwartz minimized the weight of Christian and Portuguese folkloric costumes, rites, and concepts within crypto-Jewish traditions, as if they were mere techniques of deceiving the Inquisition and its supporters, he celebrated the miraculous fact that medieval traditions were preserved almost untouched by the conversos through secrecy and deceit until the 20th century. Following Schwartz's rationale, if an authentic converso is a crypto-Jew, converso Marranism also revealed an authentic strata of Sephardic Jewishness and successfully repressed by mass conversion and inquisitorial activities. I will argue that Schwartz's views nurtured, among others, the relative recent establishment in Portugal of a Portuguese network of Jewish quarters, the Rede das Judiarias de Portugal, that enables tourists to enjoy of an exotic converso Sephardic experience of authenticity, hic et nunc, in Marrano villages in Portugal, and in real or purported medieval Jewish vestige disappeared with time, being synagogues or Jewish neighborhoods. It is true that already in the 1930s, Roth noticed the syncretic character of a few aspects of crypto-Judaism. During the 1915s and the 16s, Reba insisted that crypto-Judaism was a de facto Catholic heresy, since conversos who lived immersed for generations in a Catholic environment needed to reject the hegemonic law of Christ before embracing the hidden law of Moses transmitted mainly by their relatives. Years later, Yerushalmi, Kaplan, and other scholars such as Daniel Stuczynski and Miriam Bodian demonstrated that many of the ex-Converso returnees in the Sephardic diaspora did not necessarily live in Iberia as crypto-Jews. Many of them arrived to the law of Moses by their own, such as by reading anti-rabbinic texts against the grain. Moreover, according to Antonio José Saraiva and Herman Prince Salomon, crypto-Judaism was mostly a spurious fabrication of inquisitorial persecution and Converso social exclusion that paradoxically led many sincere and Catholic conversos to embrace Judaism as a socio-psychological phenomenon called self-fulfilling prophecy. To summarize, many of the historians who at the beginning were opposed to endorse the largely invented archetypical portrait of conversos as quintessential Jewish cosmopolitans, in the long run admitted that some aspect of the converso condition transformed them into mostly inadvertent forerunners of Jewish modernity. My historiographical diagnosis is that the question of the converso and crypto-Jewish authenticity became mostly conceived by most of the intellectuals and historians I quoted through the prism of modern and contemporaneous standpoints, be it with the help of philosophical deconstructionism or through the adoption of anti-essentialist tools coming from the cultural turn and post-colonial studies within the historical discipline. Personally, I do not deny the fact that this portrait is in many respects a blessing in terms of popularity and readership. And it is very rewarding from the perspective of the historical longue durée. Few contemporary women and men, Jewish or not, will stay indifferent in front of such compelling and relevant portraits of the conversos. At the same time, I do believe that teleology damages phenomenology. And for this reason, in the last part and the shortest one of my talk, I will plead for studying Converso crypto-Judaism per se, without claiming any degree of modern or whatever Jewish authenticity. I will endorse the idea that exists within crypto-Judaism and crypto-Jews a tendency to preserve a theological consistency. In other words, that to escape mere negotiations and punctual synthesis and syncretism. Departing from the idea that crypto-Judaism is just one of the possible variegated ways to be a converso, I will argue, as I said, that the Marrano tradition and religiosity deserve to be studied as a full-fledged, coherent set of Jewish religiosities and theological standpoints. I will finish now my talk by briefly sharing with you two of my main conclusions. First, that crypto-Judaism generally obeyed to what Claude Lévi-Strauss called a cultural bricolage. That is a construction of coherent creation from the diverse range of available themes. Second, that the syncretistic expressions of crypto-Judaism, who were identified by Roth and in a lesser degree by Reva, paradoxically aim to mark a clear-cut differentiation with hegemonic Catholicism. I will argue that the concept of counterculture better depicts Converso crypto-Judaism than the trendy and misleading use of the concepts of hybridity. And now I will illustrate the 2 points very briefly, giving you 2 examples and sharing you this brief PowerPoint. And those who don't speak, who don't understand or speak Portuguese, you have to believe not in myself, but in others perhaps. Okay, the first example, that's the example that illustrate crypto-Jewish bricolage. I took it from a very brief denunciation made against a Converso from the south of Portugal who immigrated to Bahia, and he lived with his uncle in a sugar plantation. This man disappeared, and I couldn't find anything about this specific youngster, with the exception of 5 leaflets of denunciations. And what it is about these denunciations is about that he lost in his trousers, his own trousers. He sold them to another person in Brazil, and he forgot inside a few papers with a Jewish prayer made by his mother who lived in Portugal, in southern Portugal, in Portimão. Well, these leaflets are composed by 2 different prayers. They are transcriptions. The original prayers were lost, but at least we have the transcriptions. On the one hand, those who can read, we can read here a typical Converso prayer to the God of the Bible, the God of the Jews, the God who in the past helped Israel in Exodus with the prophet Daniel and so on. And the prayer said, then God, you helped us in the past, in the Bible, then help me now in my own tribulations. This is the first prayer, but there is a second one. And the second one is a kind of what we call in Portuguese and in Spanish, ensalmo. That is a kind of brief prayer influenced by the overtone of the intimacy of the Psalms, in which it is more written with the weapon of Adonai, not Abraham. This is a bad transcription made by another person. I will be armed, etc., etc., and Adonai will give me a defense and will not enable my enemies to curse me and to make me any damage. Now, this particular ensalmo, like psalm, we find it in Portugal, among others, in the prayer addressed to Saint George, so to Saint George. Then very probably, I cannot definitively prove, but it's a kind of Jewish or Marrano prayer, probably framed after these popular Christian prayers. That is, Adonai is instead of Christ, Saint George doesn't appear, yeah, but the framework or the source is probably a Christian and popular. And here I have the first example of the bricolage. The conversos, as you know, they couldn't not only behave publicly as Jews, but they have a lot of difficulties to preserve Jewish traditions, Jewish books, etc. Hebrew tended to disappear. Circumcision tended to disappear also, although from time to time we can find people who try to enter into the Iberian Peninsula to fulfill it, or to bring new rabbinic material from outside, etc., etc. But basically, I am thinking about bricolage because the bricolage is you do with what you have, since you have very limited in the possibility to express your Jewishness, yeah, and not also because clandestinity, but also because sources and culture. Then you take different things and you put together. This, of course, lead me to my second and last point. This, of course, could engender confusion, non-coherence, and even syncretism. Because if you work partly with bricolage, who warranty you that some Converso families will not take literally prayers or expressions coming from Christianity without Judaizing them? And this leads me to the last example. All those who had the opportunity to read, to analyze Inquisition trials against Judaizers, Converso Judaizers in the Iberian Peninsula, but also in the New World, probably they will agree with me that the most popular prayer among them was not the "O hear Israel, Shema Israel," and not the Amidah, and not Alenu Leshabeach, and so on and so forth. But probably the most popular prayer was the Paternoster, the Our Father, the Our Father. Now, on the one hand, you have here a kind of late Marrano versions of the Paternoster, but basically, my impression, and sometimes we feel excerpts, very rarely, because it was a well-known prayer by inquisitors and by its victims, that we spoke about the same Paternoster, the same Paternoster. Then here we can arrive to what Cecil Roth said regarding the syncretic character of part of crypto-Judaism, the adoption of a Christian prayer as part of the crypto-Jewish lore. But if you follow more closely to the testimonies regarding the adoption of the Paternoster, and if we are sensitive to, I will see, to the function of this prayer, we will arrive to a very different conclusion than that arrived by Cecil Roth, in the sense that in most of the cases, when somebody taught another person, members of the family or the same milieu, etc., this prayer, they used to say, look, one of the things that will be enabled to be saved by the law of Moses and not by the law of Christ, yeah, is the Paternoster. And in order to do that, in many cases appear the motto. You should avoid at the end the Gloria Patri, yeah, the Trinitarian doxology, yeah, glory to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, etc., etc. And here you have what I, in a very simple way, I trying to say that at the first glance, we have syncretism, we have hybridism. But when you look at more closer, syncretism or syncretic items or hybrid items are a way to be anti-syncretistic and anti-hybrid. In other words, in a world where the conversos went to church, heard prayers all around, in a world where the Jewish material were scarce, sometimes more, sometimes less, the better way many conversos found to fuel their religiosity is to adopt things coming from the hegemonic majority in order to appropriate them and revert their meaning. In this sense, and I am finishing, the idea, the leitmotif that the law of Christ is not good for salvation, but only the law of Moses is the same. It's the same idea. Apparently syncretism, but in fact it's not syncretism stricto sensu, but it's a polemic way to construct your alterity from the position of being a repressed minority. Yeah. And this, of course, I am not claiming here that this is all the story of the conversos identity. No, they were the Costas and they were others and they were sincere Catholics and everything. I am not telling also that the crypto-Judaism was one and homogeneous. But I do agree, if you give some credit to the Inquisition files, I do agree with Salvatore Reva, Israel Salvatore Reva, that after reading many files from different tribunals, from different times, we can arrive to the conclusion that although the conversos didn't have a very structured establishment, religious establishment, and they were scattered, and many times was a religiosity based in a very local level or even in families, yeah, still we can find what Reva called classic Marranism or normal Marranism. Marranisme classique, Marranisme normal. Let's say we see here a tendency. And this tendency includes in himself a kind of consciousness of difference. Of course, since Marranism is a tradition, you don't have to be a theologian in order to make this selection between things that you can use for your purpose as a crypto-Jew and things that they endanger your Jewishness, yeah? But at the same time, in order to understand how could it be that for many generations, people continue to pray to the God of heaven without adding the Son and the Holy Ghost, and so on and so forth, the Converso Judaizers had to have a quite strong self-consciousness in terms of religiosity. And then my final point is that even though the conversos were variegated also, not only because not all of them were crypto-Jews, and not all of them adopted this kind of Marrano tradition. And in this sense, I agree with all the historians. I quote, of course, we can find here a kind of tendency to theological coherence among the crypto-Jews, whether they are educated and rich, whether they are less educated, they are poor, women and men, and so on and so forth. And this finite claim lead me to the idea that in doing that, in giving respect to Converso religiosity, although epistemologically speaking is a very fragile concept because we have to rely somehow in the Inquisition files, and this is of course a big story, and I will be glad to share with you my own thoughts. This idea enables us to look at these people with respect, without thinking about what they should be or could be being as Jews, Christians, or whatever. And I do believe that after so many years of cultural turn, it's time to return to religious studies in order to better understand these specific Converso worldviews. Thank you very much, and I will be very glad to answer or to share with you different aspects of what I said and perhaps beyond. Thank you.